Hey guys, tonight we begin with the brutal, back-breaking, and absolutely soul-crushing world of medieval rat catchers. Those shadow-drenched figures stalking through the sludge of narrow alleyways, carrying poles adorned with the limp, gray bodies of your worst nightmares. While history often focuses on the kings in their castles or the knights on their chargers, the true battle for the survival of the medieval city was fought in the gutters, in the cellars, and in the walls. A war against an enemy that numbered in the millions, an enemy that knew no fear, respected no boundaries, and consumed everything in its path. So before you settle in, ensure your windows are shut tight against the night air, check the corners of your room for movement, and let us descend into the filth to understand why a man would choose a life surrounded by vermin. You did not choose this profession because you had a passion for hunting. You fell into it because the medieval world was a place of rigid destiny and overwhelming desperation. And for the vast majority of the population, life was a daily negotiation with squalor. To understand the rat catcher, you must first understand the world that necessitated his existence. Imagine a city not of stone spires and romance, but of wood, mud, and excrement. The streets were not paved. They were packed earth that turned into a thick, sucking quagmire whenever it rained, a slurry of mud mixed with the waste of 10,000 human beings and animals. There was no plumbing to carry the filth away, no garbage trucks to clear the refuse. Everything that was used, broken, or excreted ended up in the street. Food scraps, butcher's offal, broken pottery, and the contents of chamber pots were all cast out of windows with a shout of warning, landing in the festering piles that lined the thoroughfares. This was the city's skin, a layer of organic decay that fermented in the summer heat and froze into treacherous ruts in the winter. And in this layer of decay, something was moving. The infestation did not happen overnight, but by the time you were old enough to walk, the rats were already the true masters of the city. They were the black rats, Rattus rattus, agile climbers with tails longer than their bodies, creatures that could scale a vertical wooden beam as easily as you walked across a floor. They lived in the thatched roofs above your head, nesting in the dry straw that kept the rain out. They lived in the walls, their scratching a constant soundtrack to your life, a sound like dry leaves skittering on stone, audible every time the house fell silent. They lived in the cellars, gnawing through barrels to get to the grain, the flour, the salted meats that were supposed to last your family through the starving months of winter. They were not merely pests. They were a biological tide that rose with the population of the city, feeding on the very success of human civilization. The sheer number of them was something that the mind struggled to comprehend. A single pair of rats could produce hundreds of descendants in a year, an exponential explosion of life that required constant fuel. And the medieval city provided that fuel in abundance. Every discarded apple core, every bone thrown to a dog, every pile of horse manure was a feast. They swarmed the markets at night. If you were foolish enough to walk past the butcher's shambles after dark, you would see the ground moving, a living carpet of gray and black fur rippling over the discarded entrails and blood-soaked earth. The sound was a high-pitched chittering, a chorus of hunger and aggression that made the hair on your arm stand up. They were bold, too. In the daylight, they might scurry along the edges of the walls, but at night, they owned the streets. They would fight over food with a ferocity that could frighten a dog. They would bite the faces of sleeping drunks. They would gnaw on the fingers of infants left unattended in their cradles. This was the terror that lived in every home. It wasn't just the loss of food, though that was devastating enough in a world where famine was always one bad harvest away. It was the violation of your sanctuary. There was no place safe from them. You would wake in the middle of the night to the sound of something heavy dropping from the rafters onto your bed. You would feel the weight of tiny, clawed feet scurrying across your blanket, seeking the warmth of your body or the smell of food on your breath. You would hear them fighting in the thatch above, their squeals piercing the silence, and you would pray that they didn't fall through onto your face. To live in a medieval city was to be under siege within your own home. The wood of your house was their highway, the darkness was their shield, and their teeth, iron-hard and constantly growing, were their weapons. They could chew through wood, through leather, through lead pipes, through almost anything except stone and iron. The damage they caused was catastrophic. A merchant might open his warehouse after a long winter to find that half his stock of grain had been eaten, and the other half fouled with urine and droppings, rendering it useless. A tanner might find his stacks of curing hides gnawed into ribbons. A family might find their winter clothes reduced to a pile of shredded rags used to line a nest for a litter of pink, hairless pups. The economic toll was incalculable, a tax levied by nature on human density. But beyond the money, there was the smell. Rats have a distinctive, musky odor, a scent of ammonia and stale fear that permeates everything they touch. In a heavily infested house, the smell was thick enough to taste, a cloying heaviness that clung to the back of your throat. It was the smell of a losing battle. And the people fought back, of course. They kept cats, but the cats of the medieval city were not the pampered pets of today. They were lean, scarred, semi-feral beasts that hunted for their own survival. But even the fiercest cat could only kill so many rats a night, and against the swarm, a single cat was like a man trying to empty the ocean with a spoon. Some rats grew so large and aggressive that they would turn on the cats, surrounding them in packs, driving them away or killing them. Dogs, specifically terriers, were better, bred to shake a rat until its spine snapped, but they couldn't climb the rafters or squeeze into the narrow gaps in the wattle and daub walls where the nests were hidden. Poisons were dangerous and unpredictable. Arsenic and hemlock might kill a few rats, but they were just as likely to kill the family pig, the dog, or a wandering toddler. Traps were primitive, heavy wooden blocks or simple snares that caught one rat at a time, while dozens more watched and learned to avoid them. This was the environment that birthed the necessity of the rat catcher. The infestation was not a nuisance. It was a crisis. The city council knew it. The guilds knew it. The common people knew it. When the rats became too bold, when the grain stores were threatened, when the noise in the walls became too loud to bear, they needed a specialist. They needed someone willing to go where the rats lived, to think like them, to touch the filth that everyone else recoiled from. They needed you. You entered this world not with a sense of heroism, but often through the grim inheritance of poverty. Perhaps your father was a catcher, and you learned the trade by watching him smear odd pastes onto traps, or by holding the sack while he emptied the writhing contents of a cage. Perhaps you were a failed tanner, or a landless peasant who had drifted into the city and found no other work. To be a rat catcher was to accept a paradox. You were essential, yet you were an outcast. You were the person called upon to save the household from its tormentors, yet you were not allowed to sit at the table. You were tainted by your prey. You smelled of the baits you used, strong cheeses, rancid oils, dried blood, and secret herbs like valerian and aniseed that were rumored to draw rats from their holes. You smelled of the places you worked, the sewers, the damp cellars, the stables. The decision to become a rat catcher meant accepting a life on the margins. It meant that your waking hours would be spent in the twilight and the dark, for that is when your quarry was active. It meant that your hands would forever be stained, your clothes forever carrying the dust of crawl spaces. It meant learning a knowledge that was dark and strange to ordinary folk. You had to learn the biology of the enemy. You learned that rats were intelligent, painfully so. They were suspicious of new objects in their environment, a trait called neophobia. Place a trap in the middle of a room, and the rat would skirt around it for days, watching, sniffing, waiting. You had to learn to trick them, to lull them into a false sense of safety. You learned that they ran along the edges of walls, using their whiskers to guide them in the dark, leaving greasy smudge marks where their fur brushed against the wood. These were their highways, and this was where you set your snares. But before the first trap could be set, you had to understand the scale of the invasion. You would walk into a client's house, a merchant's cellar perhaps, and you would stand still in the darkness, listening. You would hear the scuffle of claws on wood, the squeak of communication, the gnawing sound that vibrated through the floorboards. You could smell the ammonia of their urine pillars, markers they left to claim territory. You could feel the eyes watching you from the rafters. In a severe infestation, the air itself felt heavy with their presence. It was a war of attrition. You were one man against a legion. The client would look at you with pleading eyes, exhausted from sleepless nights, pointing to the holes in the skirting boards, the ruined sacks of flour. They didn't want to know how you did it. They just wanted the scratching to stop. They wanted their home back. The tools of your trade were simple, brutal, and intimate. You didn't have sprays or fumigation tents. You had your hands, your wits, and perhaps a wooden cage trap or a heavy stick. You carried a banner or wore a distinctive badge, often featuring a painted rat, so that people knew what you were as you walked the streets. This was a warning as much as an advertisement. Here comes the man who touches the unclean things. Your arrival was a mixture of relief and revulsion. Children would follow you at a distance, daring each other to get close, while their mothers pulled them back, fearing the diseases you might carry. The reality of the infestation was that it was a cycle. The city produced waste, the waste fed the rats bred, the people called the catcher killed the rats. The population dipped briefly, and then the cycle began again. You were not solving the problem, you were merely managing the chaos. You were a dam builder trying to hold back a flood with mud and sticks. Every rat you killed seemed to be replaced by 2 more. You would clear a cellar one week, piling the stiff bodies into your sack until it was heavy on your shoulder, only to be called back a month later because a new colony had moved in from the sewers next door. The city was a honeycomb of connections, and nature abhors a vacuum. If there was food and shelter, there would be rats. The psychological toll of living in a world so dominated by these creatures cannot be overstated. In the medieval mind, the rat was not just a biological organism. It was a symbol of corruption, of sin, of the devil's work. They moved in the dark. They ate the food of the righteous, and they spread unseen poisons. To hunt them was to engage in a spiritual battle as well as a physical one. There were rumors that rat catchers had made pacts with dark powers to charm the beasts, that they could whistle a tune to lead them into the river, like the piper of legend. But you knew the truth. There was no magic. There was only patience, stink, and the quick snap of a trap or the crunch of a boot. Imagine the nights spent lying in wait. You couldn't just set a trap and leave. Often you had to be the trap. You would sit in the damp cold of a cellar, wrapped in your cloak, perfectly still, breathing shallowly through your nose to avoid making a sound. The candle would burn low, casting long, dancing shadows against the stone walls. Your eyes would strain in the gloom, and then you would see them. First, the twitch of a nose from a hole, then the glowing bead of an eye reflecting the candlelight, then the sleek, dark body emerging. They moved with a fluid, terrifying grace. If you moved too soon, they would vanish. If you waited too long, they would snatch the bait and be gone. It was a game of reflexes played in the dark against an opponent with faster reaction times than any human. And when you caught one, when you felt the snap of the trap or the thud of your club, the violence was immediate and visceral. The rat would scream, a sound that was surprisingly loud and human-like in its intensity. It would thrash and bite, its teeth snapping at the air, at the wood, at your fingers. You had to be quick to finish it, to crush the skull or break the neck before it could escape or injure you. A rat bite was not just painful. It was a festering wound that could turn gangrenous, a fever that could take your arm or your life. You handled death every day. You held the limp, warm bodies of creatures that had been alive and fighting seconds before. You threw them into your sack, where they would stiffen and cool against your back as you moved to the next trap. The infestation extended beyond the homes. It was in the churches, where rats gnawed on the altar cloths and drank the communion wine if it was left uncovered. It was in the granaries, the heart of the city's survival, where thousands of rats could destroy a harvest in weeks. It was in the graveyards, where fresh graves had to be dug deep and covered with heavy stones to prevent the rats from burrowing down to the coffins. The rat respected nothing, not the sacred, not the profane, not the living, and certainly not the dead. To be a rat catcher was to witness the desecration of everything society held dear. You saw the teeth marks on the church pews. You saw the tunnels dug into the crypts. You saw the sheer, overwhelming irreverence of nature towards human civilization. But the most terrifying aspect of the infestation was the invisibility of the true threat. You didn't know about bacteria or viruses. You didn't know about Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that lived in the gut of the fleas that lived in the fur of the rats you hunted. You didn't know that the flea was the true executioner. All you knew was that where the rats swarmed, sickness often followed. You walked through the valley of the shadow of death every day, breathing the dust of their nests, handling their bodies, letting the fleas jump from their cooling fur onto your own warm skin. You were a frontline soldier in a war against a plague you couldn't see, fighting with weapons that were woefully inadequate. The filth of the job was absolute. There was no washing it off. The medieval city had limited water, and what water there was, you wouldn't want to drink, let alone bathe in. You wore your work. The blood of the rats, the grime of the cellars, the dust of the grain stores, it all formed a second skin. You became part of the landscape of the city's underbelly. People would cross the street to avoid walking in your shadow. Tavern keepers might serve you, but they would make you sit near the door. You were necessary, but you were unclean. You were the sin-eater of the city's hygiene, taking on the filth so that others could pretend their homes were pure. As the sun set over the city, casting the twisted rooftops into silhouette, the real work began. The curfew bell would ring, sending the honest citizens to their beds, bolting their doors against thieves and the night air. But for the rats, the bell was a dinner gong. They poured out of the sewers, out of the walls, out of the riverbanks. They owned the night. And you, with your lantern, your pole, and your sack, were the only things standing between the sleeping city and being completely overrun. You stepped out into the mud, the smell of wood smoke and rot filling your nose, and you looked for the movement in the shadows, the eyes watching you, the squeak of a challenge. The infestation was a living, breathing entity, a hydra with 1,000,000 heads, and you had a job to do. You had to catch them, one by one, in a battle that would never truly end, in a world that would never thank you, until the day the sickness took you, or your legs gave out. This was the beginning of your night. This was the beginning of the hunt. This was the brutal reality of the infestation. To combat such a relentless tide of vermin, you could not rely on mere luck or the clumsy efforts of a broom-wielding housemaid. You needed an arsenal, a collection of implements and living weapons that were as specialized and cruel as the enemy you faced. Your tools were not the polished steel of a soldier, nor the delicate quills of a scribe. They were instruments of wood, leather, iron, and poison, crafted in the shadows and stained with the fluids of 1,000 kills. They were an extension of your own body, a necessary evolution to bridge the gap between human slowness and rodent speed. And the most important of these tools, the one that defined your trade and separated you from the common laborer, was not an object at all, but a creature. Hanging from your belt or slung over your shoulder in a heavy canvas sack was your primary partner in this war. The ferret. To the uninitiated, it looked like a harmless, sinuous ball of fur, but you knew it for what it truly was: a snake with legs, a domesticated polecat bred for a singular, murderous purpose. This was not a pet. There was no affection in the bond between a rat catcher and his ferret, only a grim, transactional reliance. You kept it hungry. A fed ferret was a lazy ferret, one that might curl up for a nap in the warmth of a rat's nest rather than flushing out the occupants. Its hunger was the fuel for your livelihood. The creature smelled of musk, a pungent, sharp odor that clung to your clothes and announced your presence long before you spoke. Its eyes were beads of obsidian, devoid of loyalty, constantly scanning for movement. Before you released this assassin into the walls or the burrows, you had to perform the ritual of the muzzle. This was a delicate and dangerous operation. You would grip the squirming animal behind the neck, feeling the rapid beat of its predatory heart, and deftly tie a thin strip of leather or cord around its jaws. This was not to protect the rats, but to protect your profits. If the ferret could open its mouth, it would kill the rat inside the hole and eat it there, gorging itself until it was too fat to exit, leaving you with a stuck ferret and a client who refused to pay for a rat they couldn't see. The muzzle ensured that the ferret could only nip, scratch, and terrorize. Its job was not to execute, but to flush. It was the terror that drove the rats from their sanctuaries. You would locate a rat run, a hole gnawed into the base of a wattle wall or a gap between the flagstones of a cellar, and you would feed the ferret into the darkness. Then you would wait. The silence would stretch, heavy and tense. You listened for the sounds of the invasion, the scrabbling of claws, the high-pitched squeals of panic, the dull thumping of bodies colliding in the narrow tunnels. To aid in this, you often tied a small brass bell to the ferret's collar. That tiny, cheerful tinkling sound was a death knell moving through the architecture of the house. You tracked the sound as it moved behind the plaster, mapping the hidden geography of the infestation in your mind. When the bell stopped and the frenzied squeaking began, you knew the game was afoot. The rats, terrified by this relentless predator that could navigate their own tunnels, would bolt. They would explode from their bolt holes, driven by blind panic, abandoning their nests and their young to escape the musk-scented nightmare behind them. This was the moment of action. This was where your second living weapon came into play. Waiting by your feet, quivering with restrained violence, was the dog. Usually a terrier, a small, rough-coated brute of a canine that was as scarred and ugly as the trade itself. These dogs were not bred for beauty. They were bred for speed and a jaw strength that defied their size. The dog knew the game. It watched the holes with an intensity that bordered on madness. When a rat burst forth, a blur of gray fur moving faster than human thought, the dog was a streak of motion. There was no barking, no growling, just the snap of jaws and the crunch of bone. A good ratter didn't shake the rat excessively. It simply grabbed the rodent across the back, bit down hard enough to sever the spine or crush the rib cage, and dropped it instantly to look for the next one. It was a factory of death, efficient and tireless. You watched this carnage with a critical eye. Your job was to manage the chaos, to block the escape routes with your boots or a piece of board, to snatch up the rats that the dog missed or merely stunned. You had to be fearless. A cornered rat, or one that had escaped the dog's initial snap, would launch itself at you. They would run up your legs, seeking the soft flesh of your throat or face. You wore thick leather gaiters, greased and hardened, but the teeth of a large black rat could puncture even tough hide. You learned to grab them with your bare hands when necessary, a lightning-fast motion that required seizing the animal from behind the neck so it couldn't turn and bite your thumb. It was a grip of iron dominance. If you hesitated, if your grip was loose, the rat would twist and you would bleed. The scars on your hands were a map of your mistakes, a tally of the times you had been a fraction of a second too slow. But animals were expensive to feed and maintain, and they could be injured or killed. A large male rat could blind a ferret or tear the nose off a terrier. So, you also relied on mechanical means, the traps. Your collection of traps was a testament to human ingenuity applied to killing. The most common was the deadfall, a heavy block of wood or stone propped up by a delicate figure-4 trigger mechanism. It was simple, brutal, and effective. The rat touched the bait, the trigger slipped, and the weight crushed the life out of it. But setting a deadfall required patience and steady hands. One slip, and the block would smash your own fingers. And rats were intelligent. If they saw another rat crushed by a block, they would avoid it. You had to mask the scent of death on the wood, rubbing it with herbs or smoking it over a fire to hide the smell of previous victims. Then there were the cage traps, intricate boxes of wood and wire with trapdoors that slammed shut. These were prized because they caught the rat alive. A live rat was sometimes worth more than a dead one, for there were darker markets than just extermination. Gambling dens and pits needed live rats for the dogs to kill for sport, and a sack of lively, aggressive rats could earn you a few extra coins from the pitmasters. But the cages were bulky to carry and difficult to maintain. The hinges would rust in the damp cellars. The wood would rot. You spent your days off repairing these devices, oiling the springs with animal fat, mending the wire mesh where desperate captives had tried to gnaw their way to freedom. The bait was an art form in itself. You were an alchemist of attraction. Every rat catcher had his own secret recipe, a paste or powder that he swore was irresistible to vermin. You carried small pots of these mixtures, guarding the ingredients jealously from rivals. Common bases were toasted cheese, bacon fat, or dried fish, but the true secrets lay in the additives. Oil of rhodium, distilled from rosewood, was rumored to be a siren song for rats. Aniseed, with its strong licorice scent, was another favorite. Some catchers swore by mixtures that bordered on witchcraft, dried toads ground into powder, scraps of parchment with holy symbols written on them, or the brains of a rat mixed with flour. You applied these pastes to the triggers of your traps with the care of an artist, knowing that the scent had to be strong enough to overcome the rat's natural caution, but not so chemical that it frightened them away. For the infestations that defied traps and dogs, for the rats that lived deep in the walls where no ferret could reach, you turned to the most dangerous tool in your arsenal: poison. This was the nuclear option, the weapon of last resort. In the medieval world, poison was not regulated. It was a commodity bought from apothecaries or dubious merchants in back alleys. The most common was arsenic, known as ratsbane. It came as a white or yellow powder, innocent-looking but deadly. You handled it with a reverence born of fear. You would mix the powder with rye flour and grease to create small, innocuous dough balls. You had to be meticulously careful not to lick your fingers, not to rub your eyes, not to let the dust settle on your bread. You were carrying death in your pouch. But poison was a double-edged sword. A poisoned rat did not die instantly. It would crawl away, sick and burning inside, retreating to its deepest nest to expire. And there it would rot. A rat dying inside a wall cavity could stink up a merchant's house for weeks, a smell so foul and penetrating that it was worse than the living infestation. Clients would often refuse to pay if the smell became unbearable, blaming you for the stench of your success. So you used poison sparingly, often mixing it with substances that were said to dry out the body or drive the rat to seek water outside before it died. These were mostly myths, hopeful lies you told the client to sell the treatment. The reality was that poisoning was a messy, imprecise business that killed slowly and often indiscriminately. If a cat or a child found the poison bait, the blame and the mob's justice would fall on your head. You also carried a staff, a long pole of ash or oak shod with iron at the tip. This was not just a walking stick. It was a tool for poking into thatch, for overturning debris, and for bludgeoning rats that were stunned or injured. It was also your badge of office. As you walked the streets, you would tie the tails of your kills to the staff, a grotesque garland of gray fur and naked tails that swung with your step. This was your resume, your proof of competence. A catcher with a clean pole was a catcher with no skill. You wanted the world to see the bodies, to see the size of the monsters you had vanquished. It was a grim parade, a mobile display of carnage that advertised your services to every passerby. "Look," the staff said. "Look at what I have done. Look at what I can do for you." But your tools were not just physical, they were psychological. You had to sell yourself. In a world of superstition, people wanted to believe that you possessed a special power, a secret knowledge that gave you dominion over the beasts. You played into this. You wore odd clothes, perhaps a hat of a peculiar shape or a cloak patched with different colored fabrics. You cultivated an air of mystery. You might mutter nonsense words while setting your traps, pretending to cast a binding spell on the house. You might claim that you could speak the language of the rats, that you could negotiate their departure. This theater was part of the trade. If a merchant believed you were a magician, he would pay you more than if he thought you were just a man with a dog. You became a performer in the macabre, selling the illusion of control in a world that felt chaotic. Your hands, however, told the truth that your performance tried to hide. They were the ultimate tool, and they were ruined. The skin was callus upon callus, a landscape of rough leather that had lost all sensitivity to heat or cold. Your fingernails were permanently rimmed with black, the blood of rats and the dirt of the sewers impacted so deep it would never wash out. You had lost the ability to touch anything gently. Your grip was permanently molded to the shape of a staff or the neck of a trap. And the infections were a constant companion. A scratch from a rusty trap spring, a nip from a ferret, a bite from a rat. Any of these could swell and pus, turning your hand into a throbbing melon of pain. You treated these wounds with the same rough pragmatism you applied to your work, searing them with a hot iron, packing them with salt or cobwebs, or simply wrapping them in a rag and working through the pain. There was no sick leave. If your hands didn't work, you didn't eat. The maintenance of your gear was a ritual performed in the exhaustion of the evening. After hours of crawling through filth, you couldn't simply collapse. You had to clean the traps, scraping off the dried blood and gore that would warn the next victim. You had to feed and water the animals, checking their paws for cuts, their coats for mites. You had to check your stock of poison, grinding the crystals in a mortar and pestle by the light of a tallow candle, the toxic dust dancing in the flame. This preparation was as grueling as the hunt itself. A rusted spring meant a missed kill. A sick dog meant starvation. You were a slave to your equipment, bound to the service of the tools that allowed you to survive. The cost of these tools was a heavy burden. A well-trained terrier could cost a month's earnings. A breeding pair of ferrets was an investment that required serious capital. Even good iron for traps was expensive. You lived on the razor's edge of solvency. One bad week, one stolen sack of tools, one dead dog, and you were destitute. You were a businessman with high overheads and low margins, selling a service that everyone needed but no one wanted to pay for. You haggled for every penny, fighting with clients who claimed the rats were still there, or that you hadn't caught enough to justify the fee. You pointed to the bodies on your pole, to the stillness in the walls, arguing for the value of your labor while standing in rags that smelled of death. There were also the specialized tools for specific environments. For the grain silos, you might use sticky boards, planks coated in a glue made from boiled holly bark and mistletoe berries. The rats would run across them, get stuck by their feet, and in their panic to escape, they would become hopelessly entangled. Their squeals of distress would draw other rats who would also get stuck. It was a cruel, slow way to catch them, but effective in dry, dusty places where snap traps might fail. For the sewers, you needed long-handled nets and gaffs, hooks to drag the bodies out of the sludge so they wouldn't clog the drains and cause a flood. Each environment required a different strategy, a different adaptation of your arsenal. You also carried a knife, always. A sharp, sturdy blade that served a dozen purposes. It cut the cheese for bait. It skinned the rats if you were selling the pelts, for rat fur was sometimes used by unscrupulous furriers to line gloves or hoods for the poor. It trimmed the leather for the ferret's muzzle. And, in the darkest moments, it was a weapon of self-defense. Because the places you worked were not just inhabited by rats, the cellars and alleys were also the homes of thieves, desperate men, and vagabonds. A rat catcher, known to carry coin from his day's work, was a target. You had to be ready to fight off two-legged rats as well as the four-legged ones. Your knife was stained with more than just animal blood. The interaction between your tools was a symphony of violence. The ferret flushed, the dog caught, the trap snapped, the poison burned. You were the conductor of this orchestra. You had to know which instrument to play and when. You wouldn't use poison in a bakery where the flour might get contaminated. You wouldn't use a ferret in a warehouse with too many exits where it might escape. You wouldn't use a dog in a space so tight it couldn't turn around. This tactical knowledge was hard-won, learned through years of failure and lost income. You learned to read a room like a battlefield, identifying the choke points, the nesting sites, the feeding grounds. You deployed your tools with the strategic mind of a general laying siege to a fortress, except the fortress was a larder and the enemy was legion. As the years wore on, your tools became worn, just like you. The handles of your traps grew smooth and dark with the oils from your hands. The leather of your ferret sack softened and cracked. The iron of your staff pitted with rust. They aged together with you, a collective disintegration of man and material. But you kept them working, patching and mending, because without them, you were nothing. A rat catcher without his tools was just a beggar covered in filth. They were your identity. When you walked down the street, the rattle of the traps against your hip, the jingle of the ferret's bell, the click of the dog's claws on the cobbles, this was the sound of your existence. It was the sound that made housemaids shudder and children stare. It was the sound of the necessary evil, arriving to do the work that no one else had the stomach for. Even the clothes you wore were a tool of sorts. You wore layers of thick wool and leather, not for warmth, but for armor. You tied strings around your cuffs and ankles to prevent rats from running up inside your clothes. a sensation of pure horror that every novice catcher experienced only once before learning the lesson. You wore a hood deep over your face, protecting your eyes from the dust of the rafters and the glare of the sun when you emerged from the darkness. You were a figure wrapped in the materials of your trade, a walking bundle of prevention and protection. In the end, your tools were the only things you could trust. Clients would lie about payment. The city watch would harass you. The rats would outsmart you. But the spring of a good trap would always snap. The jaws of a good dog would always bite. The poison would always kill. In a world of uncertainty and chaos, there was a grim comfort in the mechanical reliability of your trade. You were a technician of death, and your instruments were faithful servants in a thankless war. As you packed your gear at the end of a long night, wiping the blood from the knife and checking the feet of your dog, you felt a strange, dark pride in the weight of the sack on your shoulder. It was heavy with the dead, and every ounce of that weight was a testament to the effectiveness of the tools you had mastered and the brutal skill of your own ruined hands. This was your arsenal, and with it, you held back the tide, one broken spine at a time. Armed with your arsenal of traps, your living weapons, and your grim determination, you leave the relative safety of the street level and prepare to enter the true battlefield. If the tools defined your method, the environment defined your misery. To be a rat catcher was to be an explorer of the underworld, a cartographer of the spaces that polite society pretended did not exist. You were not merely hunting animals, you were invading their kingdom, a subterranean empire of filth and darkness that ran beneath the feet of kings and peasants alike. And to enter that kingdom, you had to leave your humanity at the entrance, for the places you were about to go were not built for men. Your journey usually began in the cellars, the cleanest of your hells, though the word is used loosely. You would descend the narrow, slick stone steps of a merchant's house, the air growing colder and damper with every foot of depth. The sounds of the city, the shouting of vendors, the clatter of cartwheels, the ringing of church bells, would fade away, replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence. This was the domain of the foundations, the roots of the city. Here, the walls were made of rough-hewn stone or ancient brick, weeping moisture that smelled of the river and the grave. The floor was often packed earth, hard as iron, or flagstones that shifted under your boots, squirting jets of cold, black water from the cracks. In these cellars, the darkness was absolute. Your tallow candle or lantern cast a feeble sphere of yellow light that seemed to be swallowed by the gloom rather than piercing it. The shadows danced and stretched, playing tricks on your tired eyes. Was that a rat in the corner, or just a pile of rotting sacking? Was that the scratch of claws, or the settling of the house above? You had to learn to navigate this claustrophobic geography by touch and instinct. You learned the texture of the walls, the rough grain of the support beams, the slimy slickness of the mold that coated everything. You moved slowly, hunched over, for the ceilings were low, often barely 5 feet high, forcing you into a permanent, aching crouch that burned in your lower back and thighs. But the cellar was merely the foyer of the rat's domain. To truly find them, you had to go deeper, into the crawl spaces and the hollows behind the walls. This was where the job became a physical torture. You would find a gap in the wattle and daub, a hole gnawed through the oak skirting, and you would have to squeeze yourself into spaces that felt like coffins. You would lie flat on your belly, sliding through dust and cobwebs, your shoulders scraping against the rough wood, your arms pinned to your sides. The air here was stagnant, unchanged for decades, thick with the dust of old plaster and the powdered remains of long-dead insects. It clogged your nose and throat, making every breath a struggle against coughing, which would alert your prey. In these tight spaces, the panic was a constant companion. The fear of getting stuck was not irrational. It was a very real possibility. A loose beam could shift, pinning you. A pile of debris could collapse, burying you alive. And if you became trapped in the deep recesses of a large house, who would hear you scream? You were surrounded by the insulation of the walls, buried in the dark, with only the rats for company. And they would come. They would investigate the intruder who had invaded their tunnels. You would feel them running over your legs, their claws pricking through your trousers. You would hear them chittering inches from your face, smelling the fear on you. To panic was to die. You had to force your breathing to slow, force your muscles to relax, and inch your way forward or backward, fighting the primal urge to thrash and scream. Yet the dry dust of the walls was preferable to the wet hell of the drains. The medieval city was a living organism that produced vast amounts of liquid waste, and all of it had to go somewhere. In the better parts of the city, this meant stone-lined culverts or covered ditches that eventually emptied into the river. In the poorer quarters, it meant open cesspits and stagnant pools under the floorboards. You were often hired to clear these spaces, for rats thrived in the damp. They used the drains as highways, traveling from house to house, spreading filth and disease. To hunt them here meant entering the very bowels of the city. You would wade into the black water, the sludge rising past your ankles, then your knees, sometimes to your waist. The temperature of the filth was shocking, sometimes freezing cold from the river, sometimes disturbingly warm from the fermentation of organic decay. The smell was a physical blow, a wall of ammonia, sulfur, and rotting excrement that made your eyes water and your stomach heave. This was the miasma, the bad air that doctors said caused the plague. You were wading through the very essence of sickness. You would tie a cloth soaked in vinegar around your face, a pitiful defense against the overwhelming stench, but the taste of rot would still coat your tongue. The footing in these drains was treacherous. The bottom was a layer of slime that offered no traction. One slip meant plunging face first into the muck, swallowing a mouthful of the toxic slurry. Hidden beneath the surface were hazards you couldn't see. Broken pottery, rusted iron, animal bones, and deep pockets of soft mud that could suck a boot off your foot or trap you like quicksand. You moved with a shuffling gait, testing every step with your staff, your lantern held high in a shaking hand, trying to keep the light alive. If your light went out down here, you were truly lost. The darkness of a drain was heavier than the darkness of a cellar. It was a suffocating, liquid blackness that disoriented the senses and destroyed your sense of direction. And the rats in the drains were different. They were bigger, sleeker, and more aggressive. They were the rulers of this wet kingdom, fed on the richest waste of the city. They swam with the ease of otters, their heads cutting V-shaped wakes in the black water. When cornered in a narrow culvert, they would not run. They would attack. A swimming rat is a terrifying opponent. It can launch itself from the water, aiming for your face or hands. You had to strike them mid-air or crush them against the wet stone walls, all while trying to keep your balance in the slime. The splashes of conflict would send droplets of filthy water flying, coating your skin and soaking your clothes. Every drop was a potential infection, a seed of fever that could end your life in a week. Sometimes, the job took you to the gong farmers' territory, the cesspits. These were deep, stone-lined pits beneath the privies of the houses, where human waste accumulated for months or years before being dug out. Rats burrowed into the sides of these pits, nesting in the cracks of the masonry, living off the undigested food in the waste. You would be lowered on a rope into these fumes, armed with a short club and a sack. The air in a cesspit was not just smelly, it was explosive and toxic. Methane gas could build up to lethal levels. One spark from your lantern could incinerate you, or the gas could simply displace the air, causing you to faint and fall into the mire below to suffocate. You worked fast, holding your breath until your lungs burned, smashing the rats as they scurried over the walls, throwing them into your sack, and signaling frantically to be pulled up before the fumes overcame you. But perhaps the most horrific environment was the shambles, the butcher's quarter. Here, the line between street and sewer vanished completely. The gutters ran red with blood and were choked with entrails, hooves, and animal heads. The ground was a churned soup of mud and gore. The rats here were numbered in the thousands. They lived under the slaughterhouses, tunneling up through the blood-soaked earth to feast on the scraps. At night, the ground seemed to move, a undulating carpet of fur. Working here wasn't a hunt, it was a massacre. You didn't need to search for them. You simply had to stand your ground and kill until your arms gave out. The noise was deafening. The squealing of thousands of feeding rats, the crunch of bones, the squelch of your boots in the bloody mud. You would leave the shambles at dawn covered in a layer of red grease, your dogs exhausted and bleeding from 100 bites, your own mind numb from the sheer scale of the carnage. The architecture of the poor provided its own unique challenges. In the slums, the houses were piled atop one another, leaning precariously, connected by a maze of alleyways, tunnels, and shared cellars. The boundaries between properties were non-existent to a rat. You would chase a colony from one hovel only to see them vanish through a hole into the neighbor's room. You had to navigate this human warren, climbing over rotting fences, squeezing through narrow gaps between buildings where the sun never reached, and crawling under the raised floors of tenements. The filth here was different. It was the filth of poverty. Rags, straw, broken furniture, and human waste were piled in every corner. The rats nested in the bedding of the poor, sometimes sleeping alongside the children. You were invading the meager privacy of the destitute, hunting among people who looked at you with hollow eyes, too tired to care about the rats or the catcher. The physical toll of working in these environments was cumulative and devastating. Your knees were constantly bruised and scraped from crawling on stone. Your back was permanently bent from stooping. Your skin, constantly exposed to damp and filth, developed fungal infections and sores that never healed. Rat catcher's rot, they might call it. A creeping necrosis of the skin caused by the toxic sludge of the drains. Your lungs, breathing the damp, moldy air of cellars and the ammonia fumes of cesspits, grew weak and prone to coughing fits. You developed a sensitivity to light, your eyes accustomed to the gloom, squinting painfully even on overcast days. There was also the sensory torture of the tactile experience. You could never be clean. The grime of the sewers worked its way into the pores of your skin, under your fingernails, into the lines of your face. It wasn't just dirt. It was a greasy, adhesive substance that resisted cold water and rough soap. You felt coated in a film of death. When you ate your bread at midday, you could taste the sewer on your fingers. When you lay down to sleep, you could smell the cellar on your own skin. You became a creature of the environment you worked in, absorbing the essence of the city's decay until you felt more at home in a drain than in a church. The psychological weight of the workspace was equally crushing. Humans are creatures of the light and the surface. We are built to walk upright, to see the horizon, to breathe fresh air. To spend your life underground, in the dark, crawling on your belly, is to deny your own nature. It strips away your dignity. You are reducing yourself to the level of the beast you hunt. You are meeting the rat on its own terms, in its own territory. And in doing so, you become less human and more animal. You learn to think like a dweller of the dark. You start to prefer the silence of the cellar to the noise of the street. You start to feel exposed and vulnerable in open spaces. The darkness becomes a blanket, and the filth becomes a familiar armor. And then there were the discoveries. In the deep places of the city, you found things that were meant to remain hidden. You found the bones of unwanted infants, discarded in the drains by desperate mothers. You found the stash of a thief, hidden behind a loose brick. You found the corpse of a murder victim, stuffed into a cesspit to hide the crime. You were the witness to the city's darkest secrets. You saw the truth of what humanity produced and discarded. You carried these secrets with you, another burden to add to the weight of the sack on your back. You were the confessor of the city's sins, hearing the truths that the stones whispered in the dark. The climatic moments of your work often happened in the deepest, tightest spaces. Imagine crawling 30 feet into a stone culvert, the water rising to your chin, to clear a rat king, a tangle of rats whose tails had become knotted together in filth and blood. They would be a writhing, squealing ball of fury, unable to escape, biting at everything in their pain. You had to approach this ball of teeth in a space where you couldn't turn around, couldn't swing a club, couldn't run. You had to do the work with a knife, in the dark, with the water lapping at your mouth. This was the apex of the horror, a struggle for survival in a stone throat, fighting a multi-headed hydra of vermin. If you panicked, you drowned. If you hesitated, you were flayed. You did the work because you had to, cutting and crushing until the water turned thick with blood and the screaming stopped, leaving only the sound of your own jagged breathing echoing off the wet stones. Emerging from these depths was a shock to the system. You would climb the ladder out of a cesspit or stumble up the stairs from a cellar, and the world above would assault you. The light would be blinding, the air too thin, the noise too sharp. You would stand there, dripping filth, blinking like a mole, while the normal life of the city flowed around you. People would recoil, covering their noses with scented handkerchiefs, stepping into the mud to avoid your touch. You were a diver returning from the deep ocean, but instead of wonders, you brought back the stench of the abyss. You were a reminder of what lay beneath the cobblestones, a walking testament to the fragility of their clean, ordered world. They hated you for it. They hated you for showing them that their civilization was built on a foundation of sludge and vermin. So you would take your coin, usually thrown on the ground to avoid touching your hand, and you would retreat. You would go to the taverns where the other outcasts drank, the tanners, the executioners, the night soil men. You would sit in the darkest corner, nursing a cup of sour ale, trying to wash the taste of the drain from your throat. But it never really went away. The sewer was inside you now. The rats were in your dreams. You closed your eyes and you saw the glowing red beads of their eyes in the dark. You felt the phantom weight of their bodies running over your legs. You heard the phantom scratching in the walls of your own mind. You had entered their world to destroy them, but in the end, their world had consumed you. You were no longer just a man. You were a creature of the threshold, living in the shadow between the street and the sewer, forever branded by the darkness you dared to enter. This was your workspace, your office, your kingdom of rot. And tomorrow night, you would have to go back down, because the scratching never stopped, and the hunger of the dark was never satisfied. But the darkness of the sewers was nothing compared to the darkness of the human heart that you faced every day upon the surface, If the rats were your physical enemy, then the society you served was your spiritual prison. You were the cagots, the untouchables of the medieval hierarchy, essential to the survival of the city, yet utterly despised by the very people you protected. There was a cruel paradox woven into the fabric of your existence. The better you were at your job, the more people feared you. To hunt a beast, one must become like the beast, and in the eyes of the God-fearing citizens, you had crossed a line that separated the clean from the unclean, the human from the something else. You walked a solitary path through the crowded streets. When you entered a market square, the crowd parted, not out of respect like they would for a nobleman, but out of a visceral repulsion. Mothers would pull their children behind their skirts, whispering prayers or making the sign of the cross as your shadow passed over them. It wasn't just the smell of the drains that clung to you, though that was a formidable barrier in itself. It was the aura of contamination. You touched the things that carried disease, therefore, you were disease. You handled the creatures of the devil, therefore, you were touched by the demonic. In a world governed by superstition, guilt by association was a law as binding as gravity. The church, the pillar of medieval life, viewed you with deep suspicion. While the priest might bless the plow of the farmer or the hammer of the blacksmith, he would often hesitate to bless the tools of a rat catcher. There was something unnatural about your dominion over the vermin. How could one man lure 100 rats to their deaths without the aid of dark magic? The legends of the Pied Piper were not whimsical fairy tales to these people. They were cautionary warnings about sorcery. Whispers followed you, that you spoke the language of the rodents, that you bred them in secret to ensure your employment, that you had made a pact with the prince of vermin. If a milk cow sickened after you passed a barn, or if a child fell ill with fever, the accusing fingers would point first to the stranger with the sack of dead things. This social isolation extended to every facet of your life. In the tavern, if you were allowed in at all, you drank alone. The mug you used might be set aside, washed separately, or even smashed after you left to prevent the spread of your taint. You paid for your ale with coins that you had to drop into a bowl of vinegar, a ritual cleansing that reminded you with every purchase that your money was considered dirty. You listened to the laughter and camaraderie of the other tradesmen, the tanners, the dyers, even the executioners had their circles. But you remained apart, a silent observer of the warmth you were denied. Romance was a ghost that haunted you but rarely touched you. What father would give his daughter to a man who smelled of death? What woman would willingly share a bed with someone who spent his nights crawling through the muck of other people's filth? Marriage, if it came, was usually a transaction of desperation. A widow with no other prospects, a disfigured outcast, or perhaps the daughter of another catcher. Your lineage was a closed loop of poverty and grime. You were not building a dynasty, you were merely surviving. Your children would be born into the same shadow, branded from birth by their father's profession, their potential suffocated before they drew their first breath. The law offered you no protection. You were a transient, a vagabond with a pole. If a crime was committed in a neighborhood where you had been working, a silver spoon missing, a lock broken, the constables came for you first. Your word was worth less than the squeak of the rats you hunted. You could be beaten, fined, or driven from the town on a whim. You existed on the sufferance of the community, tolerated only as long as the fear of the rats outweighed the disgust for the catcher. You were the ultimate scapegoat, the vessel into which the city poured its anxieties and its revulsion. And then came the time when the isolation turned into a death sentence, the time when the great mortality arrived, the pestilence, the Black Death. You saw it before anyone else. You were the canary in the coal mine of the apocalypse. Long before the first human collapsed with a high fever, you noticed the change in your prey. You found rats staggering in the open, dazed and trembling, their natural fear of humans gone. You found them dead in the streets, with no marks of violence on them. Piles of them in the cellars, their bodies stiff and twisted. To an ordinary man, this might have seemed a blessing. The rats were dying on their own. But you, with your deep, intuitive knowledge of the colony, felt a cold dread settle in your gut. A colony does not die without reason, and when the rats die, the fleas that live upon them get hungry. You were the first to feel the bite of the new hunger. As the rat population collapsed, the fleas sought new hosts. You, crawling through the infested attics and cellars, were the nearest warm body. You felt them swarming over your ankles, jumping onto your wrists, seeking the blood they could no longer find in the fur of their natural hosts. You crushed them between your thumbnails, cursing the itch, unaware that each bite was a roll of the dice with eternity. You didn't know about the bacillus. You didn't know that the blood in the flea's gut was teeming with a microscopic army that had traveled from the steppes of Asia to destroy your world. All you knew was that the bad air was getting thicker. When the sickness finally jumped to the humans, your world transformed from a purgatory into a literal hell. The panic that gripped the city was absolute. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Families boarded up their homes, leaving the sick to die alone inside. The dead piled up in the streets faster than they could be buried. The priests claimed it was the wrath of God. The doctors claimed it was the alignment of the planets. But you, in your simple, brutal wisdom, saw the connection. Where the rats had died, the people were now dying. Suddenly, the despised rat catcher became the most sought-after man in the city. The fear of the taint was replaced by a greater terror. Lords who had set their dogs on you a month ago now begged you to come to their estates. "Clear the vermin," they cried, throwing gold at your feet from a safe distance. "Save us." The rates for your services skyrocketed. For the first time in your life, you could ask for any price, and they would pay it. But it was blood money. Every job was a suicide mission. To enter a house where the plague had struck was to walk into a tomb. You would find the inhabitants dead or dying, the black buboes swelling on their necks and groins, their breath rattling with the stench of rotting internal organs. And amidst the human tragedy, the rats that survived were feasting. With the cats dead or eaten, with the dogs abandoned, with the humans too weak to fight back, the remaining rats grew bold and monstrous. They gnawed on the unburied corpses. They invaded the sick rooms. You were called not just to catch pests, but to protect the dignity of the dying from being consumed before they had even passed. You fought battles in rooms heavy with the smell of death, swinging your club at rats that were drunk on human blood. It was a macabre dance, a grotesque parody of your normal work. You watched your colleagues die, one by one. The rat catchers were the frontline infantry in a war they couldn't win, and the casualties were total. You would see a fellow catcher one day, pale and shivering, hiding the swelling under his arm. The next day, he would be gone, thrown into the mass grave with the paupers and the princes. The immunity of the survivor was a myth. You didn't survive because you were tough, or because you were used to the filth. You survived by pure, blind chance. Every morning you woke up and checked your body for the marks. Every headache, every flush of heat sent a spike of terror through your heart. Was this it? Was this the end? The psychological toll of the plague years broke men who had withstood decades of hardship. To live surrounded by mass death, to handle the bodies of the plague rats, to walk through a city that had been silenced by mortality, it stripped away the last layers of your emotional armor. You became numb. You stopped counting the dead. You stopped caring about the gold. You worked mechanically, a grim reaper of rodents moving through a landscape of desolation. You realized that your social isolation had been a rehearsal for this. You had always been alone. The plague just emptied the world around you to match the emptiness of your life. If you were one of the cursed few who survived the plague years, who lived to see the pestilence recede and the city slowly, painfully try to rebuild, you found no heroes welcome. The gratitude of the panic-stricken lords evaporated as soon as the danger passed. You were once again the dirty man with the stick. In fact, it was worse. The survivors looked at you with a new kind of suspicion. Why did he live? They whispered. Why did the catcher, who lived among the beasts, survive when good, pious men died? The accusations of witchcraft returned with renewed vigor. You were a reminder of the horror they wanted to forget. They wanted to scrub the memory of the plague from the city, and that meant scrubbing you out of sight. So you entered the final chapter of your life, the long, slow slide into oblivion, the silent end. There is no retirement for a rat catcher. There is no guild pension, no almshouse for the worn-out hunters of vermin. You worked until you couldn't. The physical deterioration was absolute. The rat catcher's cough that had started as a tickle in your 30s was now a racking, bloody convulsion that seized you every morning. Your lungs, coated with decades of dust, mold, and pulverized rat feces, were stiff and useless. You fought for every breath, a drowning man on dry land. The joints that had spent a lifetime crawling on cold stone fused into agonizing rigidity. Your hands, the tools of your trade, curled into permanent claws, unable to set the delicate triggers of the traps. You were a broken machine, discarded by the industry that had used you up. You retreated to the fringes of the city, perhaps to a shack on the riverbank or a cellar in a ruined building. You became the thing you had hunted, a scavenger living in the shadows. The younger catchers, men with straight backs and fresh dogs, took your territory. They looked at you with contempt, not realizing they were looking at their own future. You sold your tools piece by piece to buy bread. The traps you had oiled and cared for, the ferret cages, the iron-shod staff, all gone. Your final days were spent in a haze of pain and memory. You remembered the adrenaline of the hunt, the weight of the sack, the satisfaction of a cleared barn. You remembered the faces of the people who had looked at you with disgust. You wondered, in your fevered delirium, if it had mattered. Did you make a difference? The rats were still there. They would always be there. You had killed 10,000, 100,000, and yet the city was still teeming. It felt like you had spent a lifetime trying to hold back the tide with your bare hands. But in the silence of your dying, there was a truth that the world refused to acknowledge. You had held the line. For every rat you killed, a sack of grain was saved. For every colony you destroyed, a family slept safely. You were the immune system of the city, the white blood cell that fought the infection so the body could survive. You were the necessary darkness that allowed the light of civilization to exist. Without you, the city would have been consumed. The cathedrals, the palaces, the markets, they all rested on a foundation that you had kept from being gnawed away. Death, when it finally came for you, was not a stranger. You had walked beside him for 40 years. You knew his smell. You knew his face. He came for you not in the form of a rat, but in the quiet failure of your own heart. You died alone, on a pile of straw, in the dark. There was no family to weep, no priest to give the last rites. The city above you carried on, noisy and oblivious. Your body was likely found days later, perhaps by the smell, or perhaps by another catcher looking for a place to sleep. They would not bury you in hallowed ground. The fee was too high and your soul too questionable. You would be carted off to the pauper's pit, thrown in with the beggars and the thieves, your bones mingling with the outcasts of the earth. History would not record your name. There are no statues of rat catchers in the town squares of Europe. The poets wrote about the knights and the ladies. The monks wrote about the saints and the kings. No one wrote about the man who crawled in the filth to save them. You were erased, dissolved into the mud of the past. But your legacy is written in the survival of the species. It is written in the very existence of the modern world. You were the primitive guardian of public health, the first line of defense against the chaos of nature. You bore the disgust of your fellows so they could remain clean. You took the sickness onto yourself so they could remain healthy. You lived a life of abject misery, a life worse than death, so that the fragile experiment of human civilization could continue for one more day, one more year, one more century. As the earth covers your nameless bones and the rats scurry over your grave, the cycle continues. But for a brief moment in the vast, indifferent sweep of time, you stood in the dark, staff in hand, and you fought. And that, in the end, was enough. The hunt is over. The sack is full. Rest now, catcher. The darkness can no longer hurt you. But before that final silence claimed you, there were moments in your wretched existence when the absurdity of your trade reached heights that defied all reason. To understand the full scope of the medieval rat catcher's life, we must look beyond the physical filth of the sewers and into the twisted landscape of the medieval mind itself. You were not just a laborer. You were a player in a cosmic farce where the laws of man, God, and nature collided in the most bizarre ways imaginable. There were days when you were summoned not to a cellar or a barn, but to a court of law. This was the era of the animal trials, a phenomenon so strange that it seems like a fever dream to the rational mind. In the medieval worldview, all creatures were subject to God's law. If a pig ate a child, it was tried for murder. If a swarm of locusts destroyed a crop, they were sued for damages. And because the rats were the most destructive of all pests, they were frequently the defendants in these ecclesiastical courts. Imagine the scene. You, the rat catcher, standing in your stained leathers at the back of a grand stone cathedral or a local courthouse, the smell of incense warring with the stench of your own clothes. The bishop or the magistrate sits on a high chair, robed in silk. A lawyer, a man of education and high standing, is appointed to defend the rats. He stands up and argues passionately that his clients, the rats of the diocese, cannot be expected to appear in court because the journey is too dangerous for them, owing to the unceasing vigilance of their mortal enemies, the cats and the catchers. You are called upon not as a hunter, but as an expert witness. The court asks you, is it true that the cats of the village make the roads unsafe for the defendants? You have to answer yes. You watch as the highest minds of your society debate the moral culpability of rodents. They issue summonses, written on parchment and sealed with wax, which are then taken out and read aloud into the rat holes you identified. We, the court, command you to depart these fields within 3 days under pain of excommunication. To you, who knows the rat as a creature of instinct and hunger, this is madness. You know a rat does not fear God. It fears the terrier. You know a rat does not respect a writ. It respects a trap. Yet you must play your part in this theater. You nod solemnly when the priest sprinkles holy water on the field. You stand back while they shout at the holes. And when the rats inevitably fail to leave, because they are rats, you are the one they turn to. The spiritual solution has failed. Now they need the physical one. The absurdity of the trial validates your necessity. The law cannot stop them. The church cannot stop them. Only you, with your stick and your dog, can enforce the verdict of death. But your relationship with the community had another, darker dimension. You were not just an exterminator. In the desperate, pain-filled world of the medieval poor, you were also a supplier of medicine. The line between poison and cure was thin, and the physic of the time was a catalogue of horrors. People believed that like cures like, or that the vitality of an animal could be transferred to a human. Since the rat was a creature of immense vitality, able to survive in the worst conditions, its body parts were prized for their supposed medicinal properties. You became a grim apothecary. A bald man might approach you, whispering and pressing a coin into your hand, asking for your secret supply of rat droppings. It was believed that a paste made from the excrement of rats, mixed with honey and onion, would restore hair to a shining pate. You provided the raw materials for this desperate vanity, scraping the cages of your ferrets or collecting the pellets from a freshly cleared cellar. Or perhaps a mother would come to you, her child wetting the bed night after night. The folklore said that the brains of a rat, dried and ground into a powder, would cure urinary incontinence. You were the one who had to extract those brains. You sat by your fire at night, cracking the tiny skulls of your day's catch, not out of cruelty, but out of commerce. You sold the tails for toothaches, worn around the neck as a charm. You sold the skins to cure rheumatism. You were peddling the very filth you hunted, transforming the agents of disease into the objects of hope. This paradox deepened your isolation. You were the man who killed the rats, but you were also the man who cut them up and sold their pieces. You were intimate with the anatomy of the unclean. It gave you a reputation that bordered on the sorceress. If you could use a rat to cure a bald head, what else could you do? Could you use a rat to blight a neighbor's cow? Could you whisper a sickness into a rival's house? The fear that you could control the vermin was always stronger than the gratitude that you killed them. This fear crystallized in the legend of the Pied Piper, a story that every rat catcher knew and loathed. It was the shadow archetype of your profession, the story of the man in multicolored clothes who lured the rats away with a flute, and then, when unpaid, lured the children away too. This wasn't just a fairy tale. It was a reflection of the deep-seated anxiety people felt about you. You were a stranger. You were transient. You had a power over the lower beasts that seemed supernatural. And you were always unpaid or underpaid. The Piper legend was a warning to the citizens. Pay the catcher, or he will take something more precious than your grain. But for you, it was a curse. It meant that every time you walked into a village with your strange clothes and your tools, people wondered if you were a child stealer. If a child went missing in a town where you were working, wandering off into the woods or falling into a river, the mob would come for you first. You were the piper. You were the seducer. You had to live with the constant threat of lynching, simply because a folk tale had twisted your tragic profession into a monster story. And then there were the Rat Kings. In your career, if you were unlucky, you might stumble upon this biological nightmare. A cluster of rats, usually young ones in a crowded nest, whose tails had become hopelessly knotted together with blood, dirt, and excrement. As they grew, the knot tightened, fusing them into a single, writhing entity of multiple heads and struggling limbs. Finding a rat king was considered a supreme bad omen, a harbinger of plague or war. When you found one, usually squealing in the darkness of a deep cellar, you didn't just see a biological accident. You saw the physical manifestation of the city's corruption. It was a monster made of many, a hydra of the gutter. You had to kill it, of course, but you couldn't just discard it. A rat king was a curiosity. Scholars and naturalists would pay good silver to see one preserved in a jar of spirits. So you, the lowest of the low, would carefully extricate this abomination, acting as a curator of the grotesque. You would carry it to the university or the local lord's cabinet of curiosities, presenting the tangled mass as proof of nature's madness. For a brief moment, the catcher and the scholar stood over the same jar, united by fascination and disgust. The geography of your work also took you to places that even the boldest thief would avoid: the crypts and the ossuaries. In the medieval city, the dead were not always deep underground. Overcrowded churchyards meant that old bones were often dug up to make room for new bodies, stored in charnel houses or ossuaries. Rats loved these places. They gnawed on the calcium-rich bones. They nested in the eye sockets of skulls. You were hired to respect the dead by killing the things that desecrated them. Imagine the night shift in a charnel house. You are surrounded by walls of stacked femurs and skulls, the moonlight filtering through the cracks. The sound of gnawing is everywhere, a dry, scratching rasp that echoes off the bones. You are protecting the ancestors of the people who spit on you in the street. You strike at the rats perched on the remains of knights and bishops. In the dark of the crypt, all men are equal, just bone and dust, and the only master is the rat. It gave you a philosophical detachment. You saw that the rat conquered everyone in the end. The king in his castle and the beggar in the ditch both ended up as food for your prey. You were the only one fighting a rearguard action against the ultimate vanity of human preservation. But perhaps the most soul-crushing aspect of the job was the competition, not from other men, but from the animals themselves. You were constantly compared to a good terrier or a mouser cat. "Why should I pay you a shilling?" a merchant would sneer, "when I can buy a cat for a penny?" You had to justify your humanity. You had to argue that you possessed a strategy, a cunning, that a cat did not. You had to debase yourself to prove you were smarter than a dog. "A cat kills what it sees, master," you would say, bowing low. "I kill what cannot be seen. I find the nest. I stop the source." You were begging for the right to crawl in filth. You were competing for the lowest rung on the economic ladder, arguing that your suffering had a market value. And let us not forget the seasons. The rat catcher's misery was cyclical. In the summer, the heat turned the sewers and middens into ovens of fermentation. The smell was so thick it made you dizzy. The flies that buzzed around the rats you killed were a black cloud that followed you. The summer sickness, dysentery, was a constant risk. But winter was a different kind of death. The rats sought warmth in winter. They moved deep into the houses, into the thatch, into the beds. To catch them, you had to work in the freezing cold of unheated attics and cellars. Your hands, wet from the drains or damp with sweat, would crack and bleed in the frost. Chilblains turned your fingers into swollen red sausages that burned and itched maddeningly. Hypothermia was a silent killer. You would be sitting still, waiting for a rat to emerge, and the cold would creep into your bones until you felt sleepy, heavy, comfortable. You had to slap your own face, bite your lip until it bled, just to stay awake. To fall asleep on the job in January was to never wake up. As you aged and the silent end approached, you became a repository of the city's true history. You knew which baker used flour that had been nested in. You knew which lord's cellar was flooded with sewage. You knew which inn had bedbugs and rats in the walls. You held the secret map of the city's filth. In a different world, this knowledge might have been power. In yours, it was just a burden. You carried the disgust of the city within you. You were the container for everything society wanted to hide. The final irony of your life was your own funeral, or the lack thereof. When you finally succumbed to the rat catcher's cough or a septic bite, Your body was often treated with the same caution as the vermin you hunted. There was a fear that the rat man would contaminate the consecrated ground. Your tools, the staff, the traps, the cages, were usually burned, not out of respect, but to purge the taint. Your dog, if it survived you, was often killed or driven off, for who would want a beast that had lived so close to the master of filth? You left nothing behind. No buildings, no books, no family fortune. Your legacy was an absence. The grain that wasn't eaten. The plague that didn't spread quite as fast. The child who wasn't bitten in their crib. You dealt in the negative spaces of history. You were the force that prevented the worst from happening, and because you succeeded, no one noticed. Success for a rat catcher meant silence. It meant a night where nothing scratched in the walls, and because it was silent, the people forgot who gave them that peace. So we look back at you now, across the centuries. We see the hunched figure in the fog, the pole over the shoulder, the small dog trotting at the heel. We see the scars, the dirt, the exhaustion. We see the man who touched the untouchable. In the grand tapestry of the Middle Ages, the gold threads are the kings, the red threads are the knights, the white threads are the priests. But you are the brown thread, the gray thread, the rough wool that holds the entire fabric together. Without you, the tapestry rots. Without you, the rats eat the history. You were the medieval rat catcher. You lived a life of brutal, back-breaking, soul-crushing necessity. You walked through hell so others could walk on the street. And for that, even though you died nameless and unmourned, you deserve to be remembered. Not as a monster, not as a pariah, but as the grim guardian of the human dawn. The lantern flickers out. The sewer water rushes on in the dark. The scratching stops. For now.